Bella Hanlon, welcome to Australia.
Thank you.
You're here for the Australian Institute of Clinical Hypnotherapy. You're running a workshop on dealing with your most difficult clients.
Yes.
You've written 33 books now. Every time I talk to you, it's one more.
So far, stop me before I write again. That's right.
You've been on the Oprah show with one of them.
That's right. Do one thing different.
You created solution-oriented approaches.
Right. Or solution-orientated here, I would say here.
Solution-orientated. That's even more impressive. And you're a student of Milton Erickson. Obviously, he had a big influence on you. In fact, you were his gardener. I think that's a really interesting story, how you managed to become the gardener.
That's right.
And you've had a lot of influence in your life. You operate at that top end, the top tier of therapists in the world. And it's great to have you out here.
Thank you. I one of the things that I'm passionate about is that people have the ability to heal themselves. That there is this natural thing. When you get a cut, your body heals it, except when it doesn't, of course. Occasionally it doesn't. But I think that studying with Milton Erickson, he had this idea people have the resources within to solve their problem. And so it's sort of a natural healing approach. And so I'm here to spread the gospel that people can heal and they have resources that they can draw upon to heal. And I'm excited to be here. Hypnosis is one of those tools. Solution-orientated or oriented therapy is another one of those tools. And we're going to talk about how to use this so there is no such thing as resistance and there is no such thing as a difficult client, even though some people seem to show up like that. How to find a way to collaborate and cooperate with people so they don't have so much trouble and they don't give you so much trouble. I'm not interested in looking at you as an expert, figuring out what's wrong with you and what you need to do differently to do it right, to get healthy, to be healthy. I'm really interested in what are you concerned about? How are you suffering? What do you long for? And what do you have available in your life history and in your personal experience and your social environment, your physical environment that might help you move away from how you're suffering and more towards what you long for? That's the simplest way. So I'm not that interested in diagnosis. I'm not that interested in fixing people. I'm interested in being a collaborator, and that's the second part. There are two things that I think characterize what I love about this work. One is evocation, rather than adding from the outside, and the other one is collaboration, rather than the expert. One of my clients said at one point, "You didn't look at me like a bug through a microscope." I felt like we were just on equal terms. And we're not exactly on equal terms because I am somewhat of an expert on how to help people change, but I'm not an expert. That's right. And I went to university for a long time and read a lot of books and went to a lot of workshops to learn how to do this work. But in another way, I want to just sink down with my expertise and say, and you're an expert too. You're an expert on your suffering. You're an expert on what you know and your values. And I don't want to mess with that. I want to use that and collaborate with you, and together we'll move forward.
Yeah. So it almost seems like a democratizing of the situation where people can become part of their own process rather than coming to you, and especially with hypnosis you get that, don't you? There's that thing, they want that magic bullet, and they think you're going to
hypnotize me, knock me out, do psychic surgery, psychological surgery, bring me out and send me on my way. And it isn't that way with the kind of hypnosis that you do and I know and that I do, and that is we're really trying to evoke some abilities that people have. Resources is the word I would use as the overall thing. And somewhat I think of, you've got everything you need, but it's not all put together in the way that's serving you well or serving your situation well. So I think of it as rewiring, replumbing, whatever analogy you want to use. All the wires are in there, but some of them are connected in ways that aren't serving you well, that are hurting you and that are causing suffering.
Yeah, and that if we go back to the Ericksonian approach of where do they use that resource? Where do they have it? And that nothing's bad, it's just how you apply. Is this the sort of thing that you're talking about?
Yeah.
How are you applying that approach?
Well,
where was it useful?
When are you evoking it? When are you using it? Yeah, all that. There's an old saying in Zen, there's no such thing as a weed. And I think that, in that Zen approach, everything is potentially valuable. In some places it looks like a weed, but later that weed becomes a valuable plant in some ways. So I think that that's the idea, that in Erickson's approach, everything gets valued, rather than, okay, this is the bad part and let's get rid of this. It's like, yeah, it's not necessarily bad, but right here is not the best use of it, or where it's connected to something. Like, to have fear is a really great thing. It saves your life sometimes. But when you get in an elevator and you have a phobia, not such a great time to evoke that, because it's probably pretty safe. And sometimes, I've read this thing, maybe you've read it too, these surveys of people and their biggest fears, that the biggest fear that people have, more than the fear of dying, I found this hard to believe, but I saw it in a survey, was a fear of public speaking. And I'm thinking, well, that's a misplaced use for that fear, because standing up and talking in front of people, it's not like being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger. The fear probably isn't appropriate at that point, but it occurs non-voluntarily for people, and that's where something like hypnosis is great, because you can talk to that person until you're blue in the face, and you can explain to them why it's not rational and they don't need that fear. But even though they might agree and say, yeah, I know I shouldn't be afraid and I know there's nothing to be afraid of, it still happens involuntarily. That's the great news about hypnosis. And it was a shock to me because when I learned therapy, as most people initially learn therapy, you have to be aware of what's wrong in order for change to happen. And then you have to be aware of how you're going to change. And when I first used hypnosis and someone came back to me and said, I don't even know what happened. All I know is that I don't feel afraid when I get in the elevator anymore. It was a shock to me, because I thought, I thought you were supposed to be aware. So that importance of the non-voluntary parts, and it's like the tip of the iceberg. Our consciousness is only a small part. You and I are sitting here talking. There's millions of bits of information being exchanged at every moment, non-verbally, influencing both of us in some ways. And that's probably where most change occurs, in that non-voluntary part. So that's why learning hypnosis was really helpful to me, and using non-voluntary approaches to change is very exciting.
So tell me your view of change.
Well, it's interesting. I wrote this book called Change 101, which may not mean anything here in Australia, but in the United States, 101 is the basic course in anything. And it was the only, 33 books I've written so far, is the only book I ever wrote that I didn't come up with this idea. My book company wrote me one day, just weirdly out of the blue, and said, would you like to write a book on how change happens? I was, usually I'll have an idea and I'll approach them and they'll either say yes or no for this book. But my book company, W.W. Norton, has published a lot of my books, solicited me for this. I wrote back and said, I've got a few other projects that I'm thinking of. Thank you for thinking of me, but no thank you. And as often happens, unfortunately, my books come to me sometimes in the middle of the night, and I love to sleep. I'm one person who loves to get 8 hours of sleep. And I woke up in the middle of the night, and I had the outline for that book. I knew exactly what I wanted to put in that book, because here I've been a therapist over 30 years, and I've worked with people. Plus, I've been alive I'm close to 60 at this point. I've been alive for a lot of years, and I've seen in my friends and family and in my own life how people change and how people don't. And we all know those people, that they're essentially the same from the first time you met them till now. And then other people who go through sometimes minor changes, sometimes more significant changes. So I got really intrigued with this idea as a therapist, because I've seen people not change and I've seen people change, sometimes radically, sometimes in minor ways. How do people change? And I woke up in the middle of the night, I had this, and I knew if I went to sleep I would forget it by morning, or it wouldn't be quite as profound. And I got up in the middle of the night, which I hate, as I say, because I like to sleep, and I wrote this outline of the 7 ways that people change. And I actually I've lived with that for about 7 or 8 years, and I can't find much exception to this. There are about 7 ways that people change, and they're pretty predictable when people change, and also there are ways that people don't change. But I think it's more interesting, because we're in the change business, how people change. And again, you don't have to be a therapist to make these changes. You don't have to go to therapy to make these changes, because people make changes in life, except when they don't, obviously. Some people stay the same. But I mean, the first one is a very simple one, and there was a movie that some of you know about therapy, kind of making fun of therapy, called What About Bob? And one of the taglines is the psychiatrist, who is one of the characters, writes this book called Baby Steps. Baby steps, Bob, baby steps. And it's small changes. Probably the easiest way to change is to make small changes, because big changes are harder to make. for several reasons. One is the brain gets kind of grooved. When we're good at something, even if the something is not good for us, as we were talking earlier, we get grooved at it. We tend to stay in the same groove. When I'm, in the States, I have my, I go around to the side of the car that I usually get into. When I come to Australia, I have to change that groove. And at first, when I first arrived here, it was very difficult to change my habit because we just get efficient. The brain, the nervous system, our bodies, we get habits. And those are good habits for the most part, except when they aren't. That is, except when they don't serve us. We're in a new environment. We need to be flexible, and some people stay the same. So smallest changes that you can make, these baby step changes, are probably the simplest one. My favorite story about this is the guy who ran the first 4-minute mile. It was thought to be impossible for anybody to run a 4-minute mile at the time that he did it. It was thought to be just the limits of human. This was before steroids that were enhancing people's performance. And there were about 4 or 5 people around the world who were really close to breaking the 4-minute mile. A couple of them were Australians, a couple of them were U.S. people, and there was a Brit. And the Brit was very close, and he figured out a way to do it. He was the first person that ever did it, right? How did he do it? They interviewed him afterwards, and he said, I knew it was impossible to run a 4-minute mile. It couldn't be done. Everyone knew that. So I decided I wouldn't try to run a 4-minute mile. I would just try, every time I went out and compete, to run 1/16 of a second faster. This guy's named Roger Bannister. And he competed, and every time he knew he could run just a little faster. Maybe they couldn't break the 4-minute mile. And he did that in 4 or 5 events and finally broke the 4-minute mile. Interestingly, after he did it, some Australians did it, some US people did it, and the next year 5 people ran a 4-minute mile after he did. But he made only a small change. And there are 2 kinds of changes, and we're going to get to this maybe when we talk about the next thing, and that is change the doing or change the viewing. That is, small changes in how you view things, small changes in how you do things. How you interact with people, what behavior you do, how you speak about the situation. In the viewing, what do you focus on, what meanings, what interpretations. So he made a small change in the viewing that helped him make a change in the doing, that helped make a change in the viewing of a bunch of other people after he did the 4-minute mile. So the first and easiest way to make changes is make small changes. The second one is to change the pattern. We tend to get stuck in grooves, as I said. Change the viewing and change the doing patterns, and I would also say change the context. When I come to Australia, it disrupts my patterns. It's different from my everyday life back in the States. When you go, when they say travel is broadening, well, it is because you're not in your usual environment. That's changing the context. You're not, people here speak a sort of an English, I've noticed. It's a form of English, and we Yanks speak this weird English. So, it challenges my usual patterns. Well, if you're not in everyday life, and what you're doing isn't working, break out of the groove. Somehow do something in that area, not in all areas, because most of the patterns you're doing are working well for you, except when they don't. And so when people come to see me for change, I think, okay, what's the pattern that recurs that's not serving them well? And how do we jump them out of the groove? Change the viewing, change the doing, and change the context. So those are the first 2 and simplest ways to change. The third one I wouldn't recommend, but it happens naturally, and it happens a lot to people who come to us for help, and that is have a really good breakdown. That is, and I mean that in a very specific way. That is, you get to the end of what you're doing and it won't work anymore. You get fired from your job, made redundant. Your marriage breaks down, your relationship breaks down, you have a financial crisis, you have a health crisis. Something stops you from going on as you do, and that's usually when we see people. They're in the midst of a crisis, and in one way that's terrible, and another way that's great. Because for the first time in a long time, you're not in that groove. Whatever you're doing, it's like the cards have all been thrown. Usually you play your hand and you shuffle those cards that you have in hand. At this point, it's 52-card pickup. All the cards are on the floor, and you have to pick up and make a new hand. So having a good breakdown, and what I mean by good is there are some breakdowns that just harm you and shrink you. And there's some breakdowns, and I bet many people are listening to this, and you and I, we've also gone through experiences that we wouldn't recommend to people because they were terrible at the time. But once we made it through, we came to a better place. So I would say, if the other 2, the first 2 that we talked about, make small changes and change the patterns don't work, then have a good breakdown.
if you can organise it.
Well, and that's the challenge. How do you make it a good breakdown? And that's a whole different topic. We probably won't get into it. We probably shouldn't get into it, but there are 3 C's to post-traumatic success instead of post-traumatic stress. And I'll just give you the cliff notes to them. 1, if you can connect more deeply to yourself, to others, and to something beyond, it can turn into post-traumatic success or post-traumatic growth. Second one is if you can be more compassionate towards yourself and other people instead of harsher and more judgmental and more down on yourself or less compassionate. And third thing, can you take that terrible experience and move it out into the world and contribute to other people out of your sensitivity or out of developing a sense of, I'd like to change the world in this area because it's not working very well and it led to my breakdown. I want to make sure it doesn't lead to other people's breakdowns.
You talk a bit, certainly in most of the work I've seen you do, especially when you're doing practical work, you do often come back to this theme of being kinder to oneself. It's a very consistent.
It's a funny thing, it's a funny thing after years of doing therapy. I would say that sometimes people treat each other worse than they treat their dogs, and they treat themselves worse than they treat their dogs. And, after all the highfalutin theories and 33 books that I've written, I say, it'd be nice if you could be a little kinder to yourself and a little kinder to other people. I heard this thing, Bob Dylan, I'm big on music, and Bob Dylan once said, I vaguely remember it, he said his grandmother, his mother, somebody said to him, be kind to everyone you meet because they all are dealing with some sort of struggle. They're having some sort of struggle in life. So you should always be kind to people and compassionate with people. And boy, it's so easy for us to get into, you're driving down the road and someone cuts you off and you want to give them a rude gesture, get really angry with them, and you think, yeah, okay, but who does that hurt? It hurts me, probably. It causes some stress. And I'm not saying forgive every bad behavior that people do, but if you could just put yourself in a little more compassionate place daily towards yourself, towards other people, it'd probably do you a lot of good.
So we both are part of this field, this weird and wonderful field of hypnosis.
Yes.
Lots of myths, lots
people
of
have this,
beliefs.
You will go into trance. You've got a little of the goatee there. That's
I have. I'm working it.
Yeah, but you have to have the mysterious evil eyes.
Yeah, I've got to get that Transylvanian.
No, you haven't quite got those yet. People have weird ideas about hypnosis, and I certainly understand because I had weird ideas when I started. I thought, people will make me do things, dance and cluck like a chicken, or whatever it may be. Or my fear was when I considered going for hypnosis, when I first heard about it, and I first considered it, is they'll bring me into their office, they'll put me in trance and say, you'll come back and pay me $40 every time. That was years ago. That was cheap. Very inexpensive. $40 every week, and you won't remember that I gave you this suggestion. I thought they would manipulate me in some ways. And then I thought, well, I could bring a friend along, and then I read about somebody who could hypnotize one person while they're talking to another. I thought, well, that won't work. But now, after doing it for many years, I think that all those things are myths, and especially the kind of hypnosis that we do. Because we don't do that, you will go into trance stuff. I learned a way from Milton Erickson, who was one of my mentors and teachers, that I would call permissive or non-authoritarian hypnosis. It's much more you could, you can, you might, much more gentle, much more inviting the person and making it an invitation that they could respond to or not really trying to make them go into trance with the force of my personality, with my authority. And I find that much more to my heart. And that is, I don't like when people manipulate me. I don't think anybody does. I don't like when people have power over me. I don't think anybody does. And this kind of hypnosis is gentle. It's inviting. It's less intimidating. And my mother years ago said, after I'd been teaching hypnosis and written a couple of books about it, she said, I'd never let anybody hypnotize me because I always have to be in control of myself. I don't want anybody else to control. I said, your son goes around the world teaching people that hypnosis is not one person controlling another person, and you still have this idea. She goes, isn't that what hypnosis is? I said, no. And I explained to her, she goes, that sounds interesting. Why don't you try it with me? So I did. She was a transcateer. She loved to go into trance, and she came out, and she was like, that was great. I was so relaxed. It felt so great. Why don't you come back every night and do that? I was like, I got a life, Mom. I'm not going to come back every night. And they pay me for this. But I think that if I had a chance to sit with everyone and give them an experience of this kind of hypnosis, they would have a similar kind of thing. I've had people come out and just say, that was the most peaceful I've ever felt, even when they've been working on something that's quite, emotional for them and quite traumatic for them. It's a place of peace and sort of bringing things together. And I think if I could say one thing to people about the myths of hypnosis, there are those people who do you will go into, and you will not be a smoker. Tomorrow I will click my, that may work, and it works for some people, and but that doesn't feel comfortable for me. I like this more evocative, collaborative, and permissive approach to hypnosis. And what I find is, again, they can use whatever parts of it are right for them, so I'm not imposing so much. And I like this kind of general approach to life, but especially approach to hypnosis. It's permissive, it's evocative, and to me it's very respectful, very collaborative, very respectful.
And it allows people to be part of their own process, to create it and therefore own it.
And it's the crude analogy I use is sometimes a smorgasbord. I'm laying out a bunch of possibilities, which is why I sometimes call my work possibility therapy or possibility hypnosis, and they're going to come up and choose which parts of those things, rather than I'm saying, here's what I'm going to serve you, eat this because it'll be good for you. I know it'll be good for you. It's this choice, this how are you going to go into trance and what are you going to do when you get into trance. And that's the other thing. People have this myth about hypnosis that you'll be knocked out and you won't notice anything. I think if I put you in trance here, and I think you agree with this, and for some reason I had a heart attack, and there was nobody else in the room, and the room caught on fire, you wouldn't just sit there, letting yourself burn up. You'd think, oh my gosh, you bring yourself out of trance, hopefully you drag me out of the room, and we would be safe. Because I think there's a certain awareness when you're in trance, and people have this idea, I won't be aware of anything when I'm in trance, and that's typically not the case. And even if you were very drifted far away, there's something in you, I think, that monitors, like when you're asleep and your baby cries, even you're exhausted, something in most people will monitor that. And there's a noise somewhere in the house. Something in you, even when you're deeply asleep, monitors. I think it's the same thing in trance. You're not in a totally non-conscious, non-aware state.
So what do you think is the difference in, like sometimes you can say something to someone in a normal waking state, for want of a better phrase, and say the same thing in hypnosis. And there's that sort of ability to sort of absorb and take on and do something with that offering that seems to be there in hypnosis that isn't always there in the normal waking state. I watched a video of Michael Yapko working at a conference, and this woman came up to the microphone and she said, "You're working too hard. Like, why are you working so hard? You could have said all that to her without the hypnosis, and that's what I would do." And he was saying it's about opening the space.
Well, I think that's right. And I could tell you, look at, let's say you're smoking. I say smoking is not good for you. You should just stop. And you just have to go through the withdrawal. Just stop. How much impact would that have on most people? Not very much. They've already told themselves that. They've already thought that. One day I was teaching with our good friend Stephen Gilligan, who is another student of Dr. Erickson's. And we thought every day when we co-teach, we should come up with a question to teach from. And this one day we had the question, what actually creates change? What creates change? Instead of just good idea going in one ear and out the other ear. Because, I could tell you, stop smoking, you should do that for you. You should exercise more, it's good for you. That's easy to tell people, but what actually creates change? And what we came up with by the end of the day is change happens when you experience something that shifts you. And so I could tell you something and you get it intellectually, but until you get it emotionally, experientially, until it moves you, probably it doesn't. And so that's what I would say. Hypnosis is a way to sink down into your experience and hear something that moves you. Feel something, experience something that moves you and shifts you, and actually is an experience rather than just a thought. A thought could create an experience too, and sometimes does and sometimes doesn't. But hypnosis, when I'm saying the same stuff that I say when you're in just everyday normal stuff, sometimes what I say gets to you, but I'm much more confident if you're sunk down into your own experience and open, as you say. Sometimes I call trance possibility land. It's just where new possibilities arise. And some of those possibilities that I'm laying out on the smorgasbord might appeal to you, and whichever ones show up experientially, those are the ones that tend to shift people. So I think it's really not just a cognitive intellectual change, it's an experiential change. Much more likely to happen when you're engaged in that process of hypnosis for one reason or another, and I have my ideas about that, but that's a dissertation in itself.
One of the questions you like to use, and the first time I heard it was Stephen Gilligan used it, and that was, what do you long for? Which is such a different question from what do you want?
Right. It's a different thing. What do you yearn for? What do you long for? I think that often in therapy land, in hypnosis land, we're oriented towards what messed you up in the past.
Yeah.
It's a very past-oriented profession for the most part. Psychotherapy, again, that's the image that people have of it. I actually am very future-oriented in general. When I speak with people, I'm future-oriented. It's where do you want to be and what do you long for? It's a wonderful word, longing or yearning. Yearning, our friend Robin Healy has this, what's missing? And I think, well, that's one way to think about it, and that's certainly an interesting question. I'm much more interested in, different from what do you want?
Yeah.
Because, I want to win the lotto. I want to win the lottery and be a millionaire and not have to work or something like that. But what do you yearn for? What do you long for? What is that kind of longing for your heart and your soul? I want to have a good marriage, or I want to, live to see my child graduate from, college or university or whatever it may be. There are some longings that people have, and that pulls us forward. I think people are sometimes driven by things in the past to get away from things in the past or to solve things from the past, and they're sometimes pulled. One of my ex-partners said, I feel driven all the time. Do you feel driven? And I say, no, I feel pulled. I feel pulled. It's nice to be pulled into a different life rather than be driven by something that maybe a hole that you'll never fill in your life or something you'll never really fix. What do you long for? It's a great question.
Yeah. Big difference between being pulled and being driven.
Yeah, that's right.
So what do you long for?
I've been pulled for a long time, and I'm actually so sorry I'm pulled to make a contribution in the world, because it really is, 33 books, and I travel around the world. And so these days I long to continue to make that contribution and to do it from home and in less time. I've been too busy sometimes in my life, and friendships have suffered because of it. I haven't been as good a friend as I'd like to be. I long to continue to make a contribution because I really want to make the world a better place. I was a hippie when I was younger, and I still, what's so funny about peace, love, and understanding, I still believe in that stuff of making the world a better place, maybe naively optimistic, but I really want to contribute to people, and I want to have a life.
I got to ask you about the Oprah experience, because you're now famous as a.
That's right. I was on.
Had
Oprah.
a book on the Oprah
That's
book
right.
club, and
yep. Well, someone,
you've made it.
and I teach people to write books occasionally because I've written so many people come up and ask me all the time, and so I've been listening to all sorts of stuff about how to write a book and how to get it published. And somebody said, "Well, how do you get on Oprah?" That a lot of authors ask that, and you say, "Well, it's easy. Just call this toll-free number." And they said it's a prayer line. That's it. It was just absolute luck that I got on there. Obviously, I wrote a book. That wasn't luck. I put it out in the world, but that Oprah and her team happened to like it. It was called Do One Thing Different, and it made a big difference in terms of that book. It got it out to people. And in fact, this is a long story, so I won't go into it, but someone read that book, and many months or a year and a half later, actually, wrote me and said book saved her life, and she told me the very specific story about how it saved her life, and I thought, that was worth going through all the, sitting down the hours alone, writing and the revisions and all those things that I did to get that book published. Someone I never met, I touched their life in such a way, and because it was on the Oprah show, it went out. The other thing is I come from a big family, 8 kids, and only thing that ever impressed my family was that I got on Oprah, so that was it. It was a weird and surreal experience, and great in that it got the work out there in some ways. And Oprah's not my best friend or anything, but she's made a big impact in the world. And I have some ideas and good and bad about her, but she's gotten people to read. And she's really raised awareness of some issues and helped get my work out there. So it was a good experience. It was great.
Good luck, Hanlon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon Young.